today we have the honor of having Brother Kazi Zulkader Siddiqui present for us. Brother Kazi Zulkader Siddiqui is a scholar, academician, and businessman. He's a graduate of in chemical engineering from MIT, and he pursued graduate studies at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University in Canada. Alongside his 40-year career in management and engineering, he has been a professor of history and Muslim thought at universities in Pakistan. He has authored books and articles on various aspects of religion, history, Islamic studies, and comparative religion. He has lectured extensively and read papers at many of the universities, colleges, and schools in Pakistan on various aspects of Islam and Muslim civilization. He's also been a speaker on numerous TV programs, conferences, and on special forums on these subjects. He's authored several books and published articles in many scholarly journals, including the Journal of Pakistan Historical Society, Islamic Studies, which is a quarterly journal of Islamic Research Institute, and also in the ARC of the Faculties of Religious Studies at McGill University, and he was a member of the editorial board of the journal Islamic Studies. Thank you so much, Zulkader Bhai, for coming to speak with us, and I turn the floor over to you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Farah, for the invitation and for this opportunity for me to address this very august gathering on this very interesting subject of enlightened moderation, the New World Order. And I hope that inshallah, I'll be able to share a few thoughts that would invigorate some discussion on this subject as well, inshallah. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So enlightened moderation, as I was saying, is a very interesting term. And we can see two very intriguing concepts that appear before us. Firstly, enlightenment, and secondly, moderation. So if we were to somehow combine enlightenment with moderation, concepts that really are very attractive, I suppose that's what enlightened moderation should be. But at the same time, we see a kind of a tussle that has existed from time immemorial among civilizations, that one nation would like to dominate over others. They'd like to see a one world government. And again, we've seen this term appear historically of a new world order where one nation would like to have that world order where they dominate over everybody else. Now, there are many different connotations of this term, and I will come to these concepts a little later as we go through this presentation. So I'll leave it to this point here and see how enlightened moderation and this whole concept of coming to a new world order with a single government that would probably unite the world, but under whose philosophy? What is enlightenment, and what truly is moderation? So let's take a look at some of these concepts. Obviously, I will never be able to go over all of the concepts from different civilizations, but inshallah, I'll try and touch on some of the important ones. Now, the most recent one that we out here in the West in particular, and those who have been exposed to the Western civilization have come across, is the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason that changed modern world, starting from Europe. It was the late 17th and throughout the 18th century that molded the way we exist today. There was a philosophical movement in Europe and America during primarily 18th century, as I said, where there was an essential tussle between the concept of how can you bring back the values that are required and the dogmas of the Christian church that were holding everybody back. And eventually, as people sought justice, they were looking for a new social order. They decided, or at least it moved towards a rejection of the traditional religious, social, and political ideas that had dominated the West for over a millennium. There was an emphasis on rationalism within a framework of the Hellenic philosophy. The Hellenic philosophy is the Greek philosophy. The Greek philosophy, which the West considered to be their true heritage. The heritage going back towards Plato and Aristotle and the other great philosophers of the Greek civilization that existed around 2,000 years ago. And it was on this rationalism within that framework of that Hellenic philosophy and a liberal democracy that was sought to replace that absolute monarchy that had totally dominated Europe in every single area. That combined with the barbaric tribes that had been living in Europe and that had invaded Europe, and which they are really the forebears of current day Europeans. Now they came to a realization that the only way out for them to rise up and become a great civilization would be through liberalism and republicanism and move towards individual liberties and seeking human rights for all. Freedom. Now, freedom, a term that is often probably misunderstood, where freedom can be within a certain concept, within certain limits, or is it unlimited freedom where anybody can do whatever he or she would like? Now, this combined with a concept of deism, where the Europeans started moving away from the fixed dogmas of the church and trying to say that the universe determines its own course without God's intervention. Now, this had a lot to do with the development and understanding of science that had preceded this age of reason, where science challenged the existence of God, or at least it challenged whether God can intervene in the creation or the development of the universe. Is God the creator? Is God the one that changes our destinies or our lives? Yes, they seem to feel that there is a need for a God, but that God was far removed from us. Now, within this whole debate, the Christians sought to reposition their faith along the rational lines as well, where they could see that the only way that they could keep their flock within themselves, within the boundaries of the Christian understanding, was to try to shed a lot of the dogmas and to change the essential basis of the Christian church itself. Now, this philosophical movement, the Enlightenment, as it is known as, or the Age of Reason, essentially laid the basis for the modern republican and constitutional democracies. The two most famous events that happened in this are the American Revolution of 1775 to 1783 and the French Revolution around the same time or shortly thereafter, which is from 1789 to 1799. These shook Western Europe and the destinies of the world. Now, alongside this political development, we also see there were certain number of secret organizations and societies that developed that promoted rationalism, where those societies also went almost to the extent of denying any form of God, towards atheism, or towards very secret kind of activities, where it also aimed at that very concept that I'm going to come towards, which is the New World Order, the dominance of one civilization over the other. These included the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, and others. And these were three of the most important ones that we are aware of. And we see that even to this day, there are so many conspiracy theories that float around about these secret societies that seem to exist, or at least where we find even in the West, amongst the Christians and amongst the Jews and amongst others, including Muslims, where they are where they find these societies to be suspect. Now, the other important thing that needs to be said about this Enlightenment is that the modern political philosophies that emerged over the last century or so also trace the lineage back to this age of reason, whether it is the modern liberalism or communism, Marxism, or the neoclassicism. They all trace themselves back to this age of reason, and that's where they find themselves within that rational discussion. Now, major figures of the age of reason, there are many. I'm not going to go through their thoughts, but I thought I'd just list them out here on the screen so that you could see some of them, the most important ones being Kant and Diderot, of course, and Locke, Adam Smith, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and here in the United States, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who played a major role, of course, Voltaire and Spinoza, all of these, and there were many others who contribute towards this discussion. Now, the essence of rationalism was very beautifully put forward by Immanuel Kant in his essay that he published in 1784, titled, "What is Enlightenment?" Do you dare to know? Can you dare to have that knowledge? Or do you have the courage to use your own reason? That was the essence of his argument, that you have to rise above all of that, those beliefs that existed prior to us that were limited by that faith and that dogma. And Locke comes forward and he talks about that human nature was mutable. The knowledge was gained through accumulated experience rather than by accessing some sort of outside truth. Now, of course, God being the outsider. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that the scientific revolution that had preceded this, that is Newton's calculus and the optical theories, provided the powerful Enlightenment metaphors for precisely measured change and illumination. Now, the individual Enlightenment thinkers often had very different approaches. Please do not think that all of these philosophers and thinkers were moving in the same direction, had the same theories and concepts and postulates where they put forward, they debated, they differed, they had a different eventual conclusion as well in many ways. But the positive thing about this period was there was an open debate where people were able to come forward and put forward their ideas and thoughts and try to bring about an openness, a tolerance that changed the entire atmosphere. Now, I also would like to share with you another important aspect of this term enlightenment. Enlightenment, other than the enlightenment that we saw of the recent European West, has been a concept that existed for centuries, for millennia, in fact, I'd say. And we find this in every civilization. Every civilization would come up with their own concept of enlightenment. And so probably one of the most famous ones that we may have come across is that of the Buddhist enlightenment. We hear of how Buddha, who was born as a prince, Prince Siddhartha Gautama, who renounced material world at the age of 30 and realized that the only way towards enlightenment was through meditation and a renunciation of worldly pleasures. In other words, it was a form of monasticism, a form of mysticism, a form of trying to elevate your mind towards that higher being. And he attained that nirvana, as it is said, that enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Now, I'm not going to talk about Buddhism at any extended length, but I just wanted to share that this was the other aspect which has kind of, and it continues to bring about, is seeking amongst people as to where do you bring your spirit and your mind, can you elevate it beyond the material existence, that the worldly pleasures are things that you need to get rid of. So these were two different kinds of enlightenment, where the European enlightenment went towards the worldly pleasures, that seeking that which is here on earth, essentially establishing the best here on earth, whereas the other extreme was this spiritual enlightenment. And we'll find this in other religious traditions as well. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the enlightenment in the Qur'an and the Muslim perspectives, because that is so relevant to us being all Muslims today. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. الله نور السماوات والأرض مثل نوره كمشكاة فيها مصباح المصباح في زجاجة الزجاجة كأنها كوكب دري يوقد من شجرة مباركة زيتونة لا شرقية ولا غربية يكاد زيتها يضيء ولو لم يمسسه نار نور على نور يهدي الله لنوره من يشاء ويضرب الله الأمثال للناس والله بكل شيء عليم. صدق الله العظيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that Allah is a light of the heavens and the earth. And a beautiful parable is given here where it says, the parable of his light is as if there were a niche and within it a lamp. The lamp enclosed in glass, the glass as it were a brilliant star, lit from a blessed tree, an olive, neither of the east nor of the west, whose oil is well nigh luminous, though fire scarce touched it. Light upon light. Allah does guide whom He will to His light. Allah does set forth parables for men, and Allah has full knowledge of all things. Now, I've highlighted two of these phrases in there, that Allah is actually the light of the heavens and the earth. And secondly, it is He who does guide whom He wills with His light. Now, what is the essence of this parable here, or the understanding of the Quran, that Allah's guidance is that light. And when we are within that light, we are rescued from, it rescues the humanity from Jahiliyyah being a state of ignorance. It eclipses darkness and evil, leading towards a belief in Allah and acceptance and understanding of the universe and the balance in nature. It establishes a just socio-economic order with divine values, and that leads towards an explosion of knowledge in all fields. Now, this very light, that light which shines down from above to us, it erodes irrationality and superstition, which is the Quranic argument which appeals towards rationality. Well, Quran time and again asks us to look around us, look at nature, look within us, look without us, look everywhere, and use our minds to come to that conclusion and that knowledge and that state where we are truly guided. It catapults human society towards the apex of civilization, a perfect society based on divine principles. There it is that from Jahiliyyah, that state of ignorance, we pass through that light, the brilliant light, his guidance towards Islam. And it is those who seek that guidance that Allah calls towards himself. Now, this is the enlightenment, which combines belief and science, religion and reason in a reasonable equilibrium between these components. Now, you can see that there is a very clear movement and bringing together of a sense of moderation, a moderation between the spiritual extreme and materialism, that both are important, both must come together. So in a way, it's not actually a denial of materialism, but it makes us realize that it's not the material world alone that we seek. And yet at the same time, we must reach out towards Allah, that Allah who is the one that sustains us. So it is a beautiful medium that this enlightenment brings towards us. And we see this concept of enlightenment throughout the Quranic message. Now that leads me toward the second term, which is moderation. Moderation, what is moderation? It is avoiding extremes and instead focusing on a balanced life with wholesomeness, rejects extremism, and that moderation must be in emotions, sentiments, speech and thought, the way we address others, the way we behave with others. So that social behavior, how we can truly be a part of that society that is a balanced society. Likewise, political positions. It could be moderation in food, even the amount of nourishment that we need in our bodies. It must be in moderation. There must not be israf. So is the case with dress, with customs. In every aspect of life, there needs to be moderation. On the other side, extremism leads towards what? It leads towards hate. Hatred, which really breaks up society and destroys our societies. It leads towards disunity and oppression, injustice, and an economic imbalance. In fact, there is an imbalance in every aspect of our lives. So moderation and balance are key elements of a successful civilization in society. We see this throughout history, right from the beginning of time, that the nations that rose up, the nations that were dominant over the world, practiced moderation and balance in one form or the other, whether it was purely for this world or it was for the other world, but it was tolerance, moderation, and balance that made the difference. Any society that tried to rise up purely through force could not sustain itself for very long, like the Mongols. Now, the Quran has a beautiful ayah which also talks about this middle path. And I'm sure we've all heard of this. Allah says, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. And thus we have made you a community or a nation, which is of the middle way, so that you might be witnesses over the nations and the messenger is a witness over you. This is in Surah Al-Baqarah, ayat number 143, where Allah is showing us that balanced path, that when we are in that balanced path, we definitely will be successful. And we see it throughout the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that his life was a very balanced life. And we see it in his behavior towards every person, the manner in which he dealt with other tribes, with other nations, where he tried to establish justice between communities and other religions, people who are followers of other religions, essentially ensuring that everybody must come together. So it is that ummatan wasatan that made the huge difference. Now I'd like to turn towards or bring this conversation forward, that when we talk of that enlightenment within that moderate atmosphere, what did it mean to the Muslims? The history is extensive, and we look at the intellectual revolution that happened after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ during the early centuries. It is amazing how the Muslims established a civilization that dominated over the world for centuries to come. And it was eventually where we gave up on those principles that it led to our eventual fall. But let's look at what happened in the very early centuries. Now, the very first century, we see that the Muslims were trying to acquire that knowledge, and the basis of the knowledge was the Qur'an and the Sunnah and the Hadith. That Sunnah, that practice of the Prophet ﷺ, which elaborated and showed us what the Qur'an, the walking Qur'an, truly is. And we see that whether it was the Sahaba or the Tabi'in or the Tabi'in or the early generations, who stressed on that knowledge, and that was known as ilm. Ilm, essentially during that period, had that connotation of the Quran and Hadith. Now, alongside of this term ilm were two other terms that came into being. One was fiqh, and it was also known as rai. Rai in Urdu, I know that when we say this, rai is an opinion, but actually what they meant by rai was not just any random opinion. It really had the meaning of what is known as fiqh today. That is, it was speculative thought, but it was thought within the boundaries of the Quran and Hadith. So it was not just unbridled speculative thought. Later on, this came to be known as ilm al-kalam, and it still is taught as a special science within the Muslim understanding of sciences. Now, by the 2nd century and then onwards, the word ilm acquired a broader meaning, and it incorporated all branches of knowledge, which is what we think of as today, that ilm is any and all knowledge. It's not just Quranic knowledge or the knowledge of Hadith. And at the same time, we see an emergence of boundaries between the different sciences, whether it was the philosophical sciences, the theological sciences, the jurisprudence, the sciences of the Quran and Hadith, the physical sciences, natural sciences, all kinds of aspects of development that happened from the 2nd century onwards. Now, this happened in another very important atmosphere. Of course, it was a period of enlightenment, moderation, and tolerance. Those were very, very important in this period. Now, the sources of knowledge, what were they? As I said, emphasis was, of course, on acquisition of knowledge through the Quran and Sunnah. But at the same time, the rational principles and sciences were also key, and various important terms that we also know of existed at that point in time, and they were developed very systematically by the Muslim thinkers, which included qiyas being analogical reasoning. That is, you take an analogy, you've got a principle that is existing in the Quran or the Sunnah, but you don't have the answer to another question. You draw an analogy, then through that analogy and logical deduction, you're able to come to an answer. Now, a broader term than qiyas was ijtihad. Ijtihad was used, it comes from the word jihad, and ijtihad essentially means to strive intellectually to try to come to a conclusion. So qiyas was one form of ijtihad, but ijtihad, you could also use other principles, like, for example, istihsan, which the Hanafis use extensively even today. This was a principle established by Imam Abu Hanifa, where you also alongside seek the the overall good emphasis of a society. That you cannot be so harsh where sometimes a ruling can be seen to be extremely harsh without looking at the overall principles of the Quran and Sunnah, where that mercy and generosity is looked at for societies and the individual. So this, and there are many other terms that led towards these rational principles and the development of the fiqh. Now, this early development of legal thought and jurisprudence was known as fiqh, and it was codified. We see the four Sunni forms, which is the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali, and of course the Shia, which is the Ja'fari fiqh that exists to this day. Now, alongside this development, there was a thirst for knowledge from other civilizations, civilizations of the past, where they had come up with various intellectual developments. They had done a lot of research. They had understood many aspects, things that are generally not mentioned in the Quran or the Hadith. And the Quran and Hadith accepted that this knowledge already existed. So it's not that the Quran and Hadith is a compendium and encyclopedia of all knowledge. It is not so. Where knowledge exists, and that knowledge was what the Muslims sought. And this led to a tolerance of different points of view. Naturally, when you have debates and you're borrowing concepts and thoughts from different parts of the world, it led to different schools of thought in whether it was in theology, in jurisprudence, legal thought, in social thought, in historical understanding. In every aspect, you had different points of view. And this was accepted, and there were debates, theological and philosophical debates, and also debates on human responsibility and Allah's power, which is also known as qada wal qadar. Now, this happened in light of political disputes. I mean, we are human, and even the early generations, there were disputes. There were political disputes. They were not prophets. They were not above error. They could make mistakes, and that led to wars and battles and disputes. Now, when you have disputes, and who is responsible? Is the human being responsible, or is it Allah that has decreed, and therefore we are simply subservient to Him, and we can do nothing about it? Who is responsible? On the one hand, the Quran talks of the human responsibility, that we are the ones who approach Allah and ask Him, "Oh Allah, guide us," and Allah guides us. On the other hand, we are saying that He's the one who's all powerful. Those were the kinds of debates that led to various concepts and thoughts, and they borrowed also from the Greek and the Indian and Mesopotamian and other philosophies to try and see how those people address these very important questions. So the Muslims, at the same time, they realize that there is a limit on how you can look at rationality, because of the superiority of Allah's revelation and His guidance. That is the ultimate knowledge. That ultimate knowledge nobody can supersede. The human mind is inferior to Allah's revelation. So it had to be within the boundaries of revelation, the boundaries of the Quranic understanding. Now, in that period, we find various different scholars that emerged, as I said, and various disciplines, which included the Mufassirin, the Muhaddithin, the Fuqaha, the theologians, the philosophers, the historians, the scientists. But at the same time, we need to understand that people didn't simply specialize and go into micro specializations like we see today, that somebody who is into even like, sometimes I go to my doctor and I'm amazed as to how fine they can be, that an eye doctor is specialized on the retina or on the cornea or the optical nerve, or something else, and they focus only on that particular part. And they, although probably have an understanding of the rest of the eye or of the human body, but they'll not touch it. The Muslim scholars of that time were polymaths. where a mufassir could also be a philosopher, could also be a historian. He was also a scientist. And that gave them an overall view of the universe, where you bring the divine sciences along with the human natural sciences and try to see how we have an overall cosmological view of the universe. So this cross-discipline study and debate was so important that evolved an overall view of what the universe is and what is our responsibility towards Allah and mankind. Now, there is a whole list of scholars. I listed some of them here, but I'm going to skip over the slide. I just thought I'd share some names here with you. And these were in every single discipline, you find these people, and including the philosophers. So we can, if you wish, we can talk about many people. Now, the Muslims, where did they acquire their knowledge from? It came from different civilizations, as you can see, from the Egyptian and Babylonian towards the Hellenic, the Greek and the Hellenistic, which led towards the Iranian and the Sabaean. And both of these, the Iranians also borrowing from the Indians, and the Indians also giving directly towards the Muslims and the Sabaeans, and on the other hand, the Chinese. So the Muslims borrowed from, or rather learned from, every civilization that they could lay their hands on. And how did they do this? They readily accepted the available knowledge. The old centers of learning, which were Alexandria, that's in Egypt, Edessa, Nisibis, Haran, etc. These were very famous centers of learning all over the Middle East. They came under the Muslim rule. And thus the Muslims had access to the knowledge, their books and everything else. And the Indian and Chinese traditions came in contact with the Muslims a little later. It was the centers within the Middle East that the Muslims touched on much earlier, primarily the Hellenic civilization and the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian. Now, what the Muslims acquired was they translated those great works from Greek, Latin, Persian, which is Pahlavi, Syriac, and Sanskrit into Arabic. And there were scientific works of Hippocrates, Aristotle, Theophrastus, Euclid, Ptolemy, Dioscorides, Galen, and so many other scientists, philosophers of the past that were translated into Arabic. Now, I'm going to skip through this. The history is quite extensive as to how this whole thing happened. But as the Muslims rose up for the initial 4, 5, 6 centuries, they kept on rising and developing knowledge, etc. When Baghdad fell in 1258, there was a tremendous crisis, a crisis that eventually led Muslims to look inwards. And when you look inwards, you don't look outwards. It led to a rise of intolerance and a reliance on taqleed against ijtihad. And what is taqleed? Taqleed is where people said, often translated as blind following. Well, in a way you can say it's blind following, but actually it is like preserving what is within the cocoon. You don't want to get out of the cocoon. You don't want to have anything new that comes in that could corrupt what you already have. So therefore, ijtihad was in a way looked as something that is foreign, something that can cause corruption within your established norms and values. Now, during the Middle Ages, the works of Muslim scholars and the ancients were translated from Arabic into European language. So there was a backward transmission now. As the Europeans started developing, they took that knowledge and the works from the Muslims, and the Muslims had taken many of the works from the ancients, the Greeks and then the others and the Egyptians. So those works which already existed in Arabic and had been lost, the origins had been lost, were retranslated back into European languages. Now, Europe had risen after a slumber of over 1,000 years. Now, how did it happen? It happened primarily because I say one of the very important things that happened was the discovery of America and India. It was I mean, these existed, but the Europeans discovered the routes and the paths that had been blocked to them for centuries. And when they were able to trade with America and India, that brought a lot of wealth, which funded the Industrial Revolution and the Renaissance. The church and Christian dogma were discredited in favor of rational thought. The age of reason came about. The postulates and theories of early centuries were left behind. Europe was on its path of gaining what it had lost for over 1,500 years. Now, this was the Enlightenment part. Now, let me share my thoughts a little bit about the New World Order. As I said, the New World Order has been discussed by different people based on their own concept. So you'll find that the liberals look at the conservatives in a very negative way, and vice versa. So each one thinks that the other one is out there to get us. And if we look at the political situation, we find that one nation wants to dominate over another nation or the entire world. It's a desire to have a total control. So whether it should be a unipolar world versus a bipolar or a multipolar world. We've had, in the history of mankind, we've seen different phases of this particular aspect. Now, what's most relevant to us is the recent past. Of course, I can talk about this, how the New World Order was mentioned by different politicians and thinkers over the past 2 to 3 centuries, but I'm going to skip that. I just would like to talk a little bit about the most recent one, which is relevant to us, which is within our own memory. If you'll all remember that prior to 1990, 1991, there was a bipolar world with 2 major powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, or I'd say the United States and allies on one side, and the Soviet Union and its allies on the other. It was communism versus capitalism. And that bipolar world came to an end around the year 1990. 1989 November was when the Berlin Wall collapsed, following the overthrow of the communist rule over all of Eastern Europe. Now, at that time, Gorbachev was the key man in the Soviet Union, and he seemed to be quite easy with trying to work with the West and the United States. Encouraged by Bush, he started a process of democratization towards the end of '89, and that led to a total breakup of the Soviet Union. During 1990 and 91, it eventually burst open, and the Soviet Union was also dissolved and broken into several republics, independent republics, at the end of 1991. In parallel with this collapse of the USSR, there was a parallel development where George H.W. Bush, the senior, who was president of the United States, came to realize that the USSR was no longer a real threat to the US and the West. And the focus shifted more towards economic interests, leading towards the Gulf War. And here in the Gulf War, we know that Saddam Hussein, we can discuss the aspects of it, but I'm just going to share with you some of the key dates here, where he invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. And we know how the US built up its troops positioned in Saudi Arabia, leading towards the actual military operation in January and February of 1991. That led to a total control of the Middle East and that entire region by the United States. And that's when George W. Bush made that famous statement before the Congress on, it so happens to have been also the 11th of September, the 9/11 of 1990. He said, "We stand today at a unique and extraordinary moment. The crisis in the Persian Gulf, as grave as it is, also offers a rare opportunity to move toward an historic period of cooperation. Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order. He uses the actual word, the term, a new world order can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace. An era in which nations of the world, East and West, North and South, can prosper and live in harmony. Of course, the underlying statement or the underlying assumption was that it was the United States becoming the unipolar power all over the world, would be the one that would try to control this new world order, which in the American understanding would bring about justice and peace and no terror. And all of the nations of the East, West, North, and South would follow in line and will prosper and live in harmony. It was a beautiful concept, of course, from his point of view. Now, if you look at what happens after the Gulf War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the world was not really in peace. There was a struggle for freedom in many countries. And when it was a bipolar world, these smaller nations or the smaller movements could rely on one side or the other, and they kept a balance. Now, what this also led to was Israel's persecution or occupation of Palestine that gained further momentum with the US backing, leading to further problems and a disturbance throughout the Middle East. The US also backed despotic regimes in the Muslim countries, and not only Muslim countries, but also South America and other parts, which met with resistance and discontent. So that the desire to have that one world government, and I being the one that controls with my philosophy, was not really leading towards that peace, as George Bush had stated. Uprisings, disturbances, and civil war in many Muslim countries led to the essential fact where USA was then seen as a new colonialist power. The Soviet Union had disappeared. The US vision of the new world order meant that it seemed to be moving towards global political and military invasion, a true one world government, a major incursion into cultural and social norms and values of all countries, eroding their way of life, which is what we see happening even to this day. Now, every nation has a crisis at one point in time or the other, and that's what leads to the rise and fall of nations. This again is a very interesting subject as to what is it that causes the rise and fall of nations, why at different periods of time some nations are at the top and some are at the bottom. What are those elements that cause this? And that is again a subject of discussion maybe at some other time. But what happens in between is that the power changes from one nation to another. While one nation rises, another one falls, and one takes over the control. But when a crisis happens, it brings back an awareness for introspection and self-rectification. So when you are the underdog, when you are in pain, then you sit back and think, what went wrong with me? Was it my internal problem, or was it something that was external? Now, we Muslims are currently in a state of confusion after the latest onslaught over the past few centuries, where we lost that control, we lost that khilafat, we lost the political, cultural, emotional, and social control over our lives. Now, there are many major crises in Muslim history. I just listed out a few, some key events that happened. I'm not going to go through them in detail, like I said, due to lack of time. But right from the very beginning, we start with the battles and disputes between Hazrat Ali and Hazrat Muawiyah, the Karbala tragedy, the fall of Baghdad, which was probably the most important of them all, the fall of Granada in Spain, when Vasco da Gama landed at Calicut in India, and opened up Europe, India to Europe. The Ottomans defeated at the siege of Vienna, the Battle of Plassey, where the British finally made major inroads into India, Tipu Sultan's Shahadat at Seringapatam, and of course the last war between the British and Mughals in 1857-58, which led to essentially massive massacres of Muslims and an end to the Mughal Empire. And 18th and 19th centuries, we see Western colonization of Asia and Africa, and where they steal the wealth and destroy the societies within these countries. Now, the First World War was the other major debacle when the Ottomans were defeated, leading to the treaties of Sèvres and Lausanne and the abolishment of the Khilafat on March 3rd, 1924 by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. 1948, we saw the creation of the modern state of Israel, which led to major disturbance and is still the major cause of conflict amongst the Muslims and the West. And 67, where Israel occupied Jerusalem. 1971, when Pakistan was eventually split into two and Bangladesh was created. 1990-91, I've already talked about the Gulf War, and also the dissolution of the Soviet Union, leading to a unipolar world. That led to the final one, the nail in the coffin for us, the 9/11 attacks in USA and the beginning of Islamophobia in the year 2001. Now, there are many, many more events. I've skipped over so many others in different parts of the world, but those are events of history that need to be studied and understood. Now, the present Muslim Ummah, the way we are today, effectively, we are in a state of jahiliyyah, if we can ponder over it and think over it, because we are the antithesis of the ideal state defined in the Qur'an and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Our state lacks enlightenment. There are few enlightened individuals, but they have no way to bring about that change, or at least their efforts have been unsuccessful. The overall condition is not worthy of emulation, where others look at us and say, if this is what Islam is, then we don't want to be Muslim. We have a serious issue. Can we set that example? We don't have many examples to show, unfortunately. Our conditions are similar to past nations that were destroyed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are unethical, we are dishonest, we are divided, racist, ethnic bonding exists. And there is regionalism amongst us. There is extremism, fanaticism, we are short-sighted. We are ignorant, lack knowledge in all spheres. We are superstitious, and we have closed minds. That is what is true Jahiliyyah. And we have gone around in a full circle, gone back to that state that existed pretty much prior to the coming of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it is not a wonder that we are now dominated by all other nations in the world. That leads me to this very interesting concept of enlightened moderation. Now, where does this term enlightened moderation come from? It's an interesting fact that this term was coined by General Pervez Musharraf, who was the president of Pakistan from 1999 to 2008. Musharraf, may Allah have mercy on him, died just a week or two back, and we ask for forgiveness for him. And may Allah grant him Jannah, because I do believe that Musharraf was a true patriot, though he may have been misguided in many ways, where he made a lot of mistakes as well, but he did a lot of good things. Now, he was the one, after 9/11, came up with his own analysis and a plea, and he called this enlightened moderation. And I'd like you to understand what he really meant by this and how that interacted with the New World Order. At various important occasions, starting from the UN General Assembly in September of 2003 to the OIC Islamic Summit, and there was World Economic Forum, etc. He spoke about his concept of enlightened moderation. He also wrote an article in the Washington Post in the year 2004, on the 1st of June. You can read that article of his. It is available in the archives of Washington Post. So he kept on with his own thought. What was his point of view? And I think it's worth pondering over what he said at that point in time. He says that post 1990, remember that was the time after the Gulf War, and the Afghan War was also in progress. It was a tumultuous period, suffering of innocents who were Muslims primarily at the hands of militants, extremists, and terrorists. And he said that we need to bring order to this troubled scene, and therefore enlightened moderation is needed. The world is a very dangerous place now, with all sorts of weaponry, suicide bombers, remote control devices. Both perpetrators of crime and those who suffer are Muslim. Now, this is where I think that he went a little wrong, assuming that it was only Muslims who were the perpetrators of crime, and we all know the reality. And what did this lead to? That non-Muslims wrongly believe that Islam is intolerant, militant, and terrorist. The perception of what is Islam and what are Muslims. Muslims are the poorest, most uneducated, most powerless, and disunited people. So what will be our legacy for the future generations? And he talks about the need to raise ourselves by individual achievement and collective socio-economic emancipation. So therefore, we must stop the carnage in the world and stem the downward slide of the Muslims. Now, he's got some very valid points there, no doubt about it. And we all have to agree with his analysis in many ways here. And he talks about the causes of conflict, where he says that the extremism and militancy that existed were a direct outcome of political injustice, denial, and deprivation, which is true. And combined with stark poverty and illiteracy, it is an explosive mix, leading towards hopelessness and powerlessness, which leads to militancy, extremism, and terrorism. Yes, I think there are some very important things that he talks about in the causes. Now, he also gives his own version of the history of terrorism. That is, prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, the sole cause for Muslim unrest before the anti-Soviet Afghan war was Palestine, which is true, and Kashmir to an extent, but Kashmir was not highlighted very much. Palestine was the one that everybody talked about. The Afghan war against Soviets with support of the West led to pan-Islamic militancy. When the Soviet Union collapsed, conflicts arose in many countries, including ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, the Chechen uprising, the Kashmir freedom movement, and the Palestinian Intifada. Militancy was allowed to fester in Afghanistan for a decade, and the West turned a blind eye to it, which led to a multi-directional hostility amongst fighters and the birth of Al-Qaeda. Intifada in Palestine provoked the Muslims globally. The result was that certain individuals who eventually wanted to bring it out on the US and the West caused 9/11. And the 9/11 led to an angry reaction of USA against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And also the Iraq operation, an operation which destabilized the entire Middle East. The Muslim masses were polarized against USA, although many governments sided with the US, including Musharraf's government, but the masses turned more and more against the United States. Their perception was that the US was now the real oppressor over us. Now, Musharraf, his statement here is that it is not Islam as a religion that has created militancy and extremism, but rather political disputes that have led to antagonism amongst the Muslim masses. I suppose I will agree with him on this statement. So the current state of affairs, he says, is that we have forsaken the values left far behind in social, moral, and economic development, reached the depths of despair and despondency. And this will conflict and militancy lead us, will this conflict and militancy lead us back to our past glory and show light of progress and development? That's a question he asks. Can we really use that militancy to bring back our glory? Will it really provide us success? He says, no, it will not. This militancy is not the solution. So his solution is enlightened moderation. What is his enlightened moderation? It's got two parts to it. The first part is where he addresses the Muslim world and he asks them to shun militancy and extremism and adopt a path of socio-economic uplift. At the same time, he has a plea towards the West and the US in particular, and asks them, requests them, beseeches them to resolve all political disputes with justice and to aid in socio-economic betterment of the deprived Muslim world. Now, this he considered to be a part of this formula. So one cannot happen without the other. And will the West do what was his beckoning and his request? Well, it has not happened for sure. So the future, where he calls upon the West to help resolve political disputes with justice, it has to be a commitment towards enlightened moderation. His enlightened moderation for the entire world, not just for the Muslims. And for the Muslims, they need to introspect and determine future course. This would be the Muslim contribution towards the enlightened moderation. Now, in this passionate plea to Muslims, he reminds us of our glorious past, based on justice, law, tolerance, and values, knowledge, enlightenment, tolerance within our ranks and with the other faiths, and where he also reminds us that the conversion to Islam was not at the tip of the sword. And he quotes a personal example of our Holy Prophet ﷺ, who personified justice, compassion, tolerance of others, generosity of spirit, austerity, with a spirit of sacrifice and a burning desire to make a better world. Very beautiful analysis, I would say. And the way forward, therefore, he talks about is through enlightenment, must concentrate on human resource development through alleviation of poverty, education, healthcare, and social justice, without a confrontation with the West, and adopting a path of moderation and conciliatory approach to fight common belief that Islam is a religion of to fight the belief that their belief, that is the best belief of the West, that Islam is a religion of militancy in conflict with modernization, democracy, and secularism. He says that that is not the case, and that he's trying to be conciliatory, and he's asking the Muslims to be conciliatory and to go towards moderation. And this must be done with a realization that in the world we live in, there must be fairness and realizing that fairness does not always rule. Now that is the contrary part of it. That could you be conciliatory and also accept that there will not be fairness? So there is a level of contradiction in itself. Now it does make a lot of sense, doesn't it? That Islam is enlightening and it preaches moderation, that we are the ummatan wasatan. So should we not espouse what Musharraf was saying, just as what the OIC did in June of 2004? Unfortunately, it did not follow through. One of the reasons it did not was that Musharraf's own legacy, while in theory it was very nice, he could not adjust the faith and priorities in the face of the Western onslaught, and where he accepted the Western hegemony and also wanted to gain the nod through conciliation, need to adjust the material side of life based on the exigencies of modern life, and provided a way out for the well-to-do amongst the Muslims by showing them as moderate without really resolving the issues of poverty and justice, which was at the lower level. How could you get rid of that militancy at the lower level when you are addressing only a way out only for those who are well-to-do amongst the Muslims? So in practice, he succumbed to the West, which led to the deaths of over 80,000 Pakistanis, hundreds of thousands of Afghanis and Iraqis and others, and incarceration of hundreds at Guantanamo Bay. It did not solve the problem. Now, there is a very interesting discussion that comes out of it, is that about Islam and rationalism. I mean, in light of, we look at the Enlightenment in the West of Europe and the concept that Musharraf put forward, are Islam and rationalism incompatible. And I'm going to very quickly go through this because I know I've taken up a lot of time. Are religion and science necessarily opposed to each other? Do we necessarily have to give up religion in order to have material and scientific progress? Does religion negate rationality? If you look at recent Muslim attitudes, we see that people have come up with this concept that Islam is a scientific religion. These are people who are educated and who really believe very strongly that Islam is within that scientific realm and that the Qur'an is scientific. They find many examples of compatibility with science, trying to that the Qur'an is rational, not the other way around. That is, the Qur'an now becomes subservient to human rationality. There's a mountain of apologetic literature trying to prove that the Qur'an is the word of God because it contains theories and facts discovered recently by modern science. So modern science becomes the litmus test, the parameter that determines that the Quran is true and not the other way around. Now, the task ahead was for us is to formulate valid questions and a language of discourse, to move away from apologetics and superficial issues and try to understand and educate Muslim secular scientists on Islamic thought and not vice versa. We need to encourage discourse on rationality within the realm of revelation. Now, this is so important that for a Muslim, the revelation is one that is above rationality, that is above human thought. So if you look at science, science is within rationality, it is within the human mind. It's based on empirical data, on repeated observations, on laws that are derived, hypotheses which are calculated guesses, which keep on changing. The laws keep on changing and our observations keep on changing. It's not absolute knowledge. And therefore, these theories are not there to stay. So what we believe in today will not be the same tomorrow. Religion is beyond rationality. It is based on faith, based on that iman and what Allah has taught us through science and nature and through revelation. These are laws that are revealed to us through Quran and the previous books. And therefore, there is a faith in the unseen. It is not calculated like hypotheses are calculated guesses. There is belief in the absoluteness of the divine attributes. So Allah's revelation and guidance are the highest form of knowledge. It is absolute and gives us the basis for rational thought. So rational thought is not denied. It must remain within that revelation that is given to us. So the Quranic view is that man is encouraged to acquire more knowledge through observation. Of course, you must see, look around us and try to find out the truth. Science and rationality are essential tools for acquisition of empirical and analytical knowledge. Science and technology provide the basis for human development and progress on earth. But at the same time, man's behavior is regulated by divine revelation, which supersedes human desire. Human reason cannot override divine revelation. This is the essence of the Quranic message. The laws of Allah are in conformity with the laws of nature. They go hand in hand. So scientific and religious inquiry belong to different and complementary domains, not opposite domains, each having a very important role to play for human existence on earth. And that was a success of the Muslim scientists and scholars of the early generations. So the recipe for success is to create harmony between divine knowledge and human scientific understanding, eliminate intolerance and schisms. The key to success is a control over parameters of success on earth based on divine values. Material strength on earth will provide us a stronger society that would seek righteousness on earth. This will give us a better chance to obtain the best in the hereafter. And to bring about that change, Allah has given us this recipe, an ayat we quote often, that Inna Allah la yughayru ma biqawmin hatta yughayru ma bi anfusihim. Surely Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change their own condition. So that which we must strive for and bring about that change intellectually and through other means, material means, will bring about the change that is required for us to make a better life, a better civilization a better human being out of us. And that's what provides the basis for us to reach out to Allah and seek His guidance. And within that guidance, we then can be the best of nations. I will conclude with that. I know I may have taken a little longer than I had thought I would, but I hope that this has provided some food for thought, and I thank you all for this. I'll conclude my talk with this. Thank you very much.
Jazakallah khair, Zulkader bhai. That was just amazing. You brought so many things for us to consider, to think about, even from the beginning, the overview of the Age of Enlightenment within Europe and the mention of Buddhist enlightenment and how that all relates to Islamic enlightenment. It was just amazing. And I cannot do your presentation justice by trying to summarize what you said, so I'm not going to attempt that. But thank you so much for all of your thoughtful thoughts for us to consider. So what I'd like to do now is, if there are any questions that anyone would like to raise, either just please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask, or you are more than welcome to put them in the chat, and then I will be more than happy to read out the questions. Brother Wasim will give some closing remarks.
First of all, mashallah, today is one of the largest participants we have so far, and this is a very good sign. And we are very thankful to Zulkader bhai for such a great presentation, very intellectual talk, and we learned a lot today. The topic is itself is very important in a way, that enlightened moderation in the new world order. Thank you so much, Zulkader bhai, and I wish we continue your talks in future also. MKS is very proud to have such scholars time to time, our great participants, and whoever participate, and just send the word of mouth to other people to see that how important those lectures are.
Kazi, how will you like to bring the enlightenment to the people now?
Well, each one of us here is an individual, and a change is brought about in a society mostly in a collective fashion, and that collectivism can come through a social movement, it can come through a revolution, it can come through a political process, it can come through a military process. Individuals, if you look at the history, and I definitely would like to quote from the life of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that the initial years where he worked as an individual brought about a change on the individual level. That is training for people that creates the environment to bring about the real revolution. And the transition from the individual period to a collective period, that is that hijrat that we need to perform within ourselves and as a society, could happen in different ways. And we'll see this in history in different nations. Some have been very bloody, some have been very, very peaceful. Now, what is that process within the current state of the world is something where probably I may not be in a position to really answer, because there are so many complications. The world has moved to a point where technology, where the kind of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge that is there, and who controls the mind of others, is extremely complicated. I think that from our perspective as individuals, we need to create that awareness amongst ourselves, that awareness as to how we can be better individuals and how we can at least make the circle of people around us into better individuals. Can that lead to that change? Maybe it'll eventually generate forward. So in that sense, I like the approach of the Tablighi Jamaat, who do believe that at least on our level, we need to do this work. Unless if one of us feels that I can really bring about that change from the top down, I can take control over societies, over nations, and bring about that change, like what Musharraf probably tried to do, or certain other leaders who think that they can do it, or certain movements where they were violent, whether it was the extremist militants, or it was certain other people who tried to bring about that change. Yes, maybe they may be in a position to do so. So it all depends on who you are, where you are, and what can you do to bring about that change. I would say that we still need to, my own belief, of course, is that it has to be within the Quranic principles, and recognizing that the Quran is the supreme knowledge. That does not mean that we do, like I said, we give up on our own search for knowledge that is around us. That is, we acquire that knowledge. We should continue to do that.
Kazi, do you mean to say that if there's a scientist working on a project, say, and researching, and before he comes to a conclusion, and should he go and check with Quran whether the conclusion is in accordance with Quran or not?
I think you're getting this wrong there, Islam. See, the Quran is not an encyclopedia of all world knowledge. And the Quran is not going to have answers to many of the experiments. In fact, the vast number of experiments that you're going to be doing. It's like, you see, like even in Islamic legal thought, we talk of the 5 different realms. The extremes are that which is commanded of you and that which is prohibited. And those are very, very few things. In between is a huge area, which is 99.999% of human activity, which is considered to be as mubah. And within mubah, of course, you also have that which is preferred and that which is undesirable. That mubah area is where you try your level best using your rationality and ensuring that you remain within the boundaries and seeking the goodness. And when you seek goodness, that's what leads to that which is preferred or that which is undesirable. And whether you eat bananas or you eat oranges, the Quran does not tell you, would you please have bananas rather than oranges? I mean, I'm giving you a very simple example, but also within experimentation where you're seeking knowledge, that knowledge which exists within nature, that knowledge which is already created, and you are seeking that knowledge through experimentation, through data acquisition, that you don't need to go back to the Quran and say, does this exist? Because the Quran is not going to have that answer for you. It's not meant to have that answer. The Quran is there as guidance to make us into nations and human beings that would be within those parameters of justice, of mercy, and within the parameters where we can be good human beings leading towards goodness on earth and seeking the hereafter.
Okay, another question. So what you mean is that if we categorize scientists, so do you mean that the Muslim scientists should behave a bit, I mean, not largely, but a bit different than the other scientists who do not believe in Islam? I can give you 2 examples. For example, Newton was religious, but then he came with theories which mostly still work in certain circumstances. And Darwin came up with a theory. Now, if he had considered religion, he wouldn't come with that theory because he would be afraid of the religious backlash on that. Well, that's another thing that it's very old now, and there have been modifications in that. So why not just say that scientists should do their own work and work independently, while theologians like yourself, for example, or other people, they can then come up with their own theories on science, so they can go independently.
There is no conflict between divine knowledge and scientific knowledge. The realms are not contradictory, except where at times where science thought that the essential concept of God itself or the concept of creation may not be required. And recent science over the past century has changed the whole concept, where if you remember what Hubble discovered of the origin of the universe, and when we go backwards, we come to the point where it says that the universe actually started at a certain point in time. It was like about 13.8 billion years ago. And he proved it through his own data acquisition and through watching the universe through his telescopes. And coming to that conclusion that the world is expanding, the universe is expanding, and that expansion meant that when you go backwards, you come back to a time where you have that origin. So that whole debate, I think the debate where apparently there was a conflict between science and religion was on the origin of the universe. And if there is an origin, then there is the originator or the creator. So that's a debate we can discuss about this separately as to how science itself has come a full circle and come back to that same point. Now, other than that, if you look at life in general, the problem actually which arises, I think, within the Western liberal thought and the Quranic thought is the limits to human activity. It's not about science. It's not about Darwinism or about what Newton or Einstein or Hubble said. I don't think that those are issues at all. The issue comes to where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a certain way of life, and that life must remain within our daily activity, within certain boundaries. So today I can say that I don't accept those. I can have a relationship outside of marriage. I can have a society that is free, where I do what I wish. I can say what I wish, hurt anybody else, where I can. Those are the essential things where I think that we are coming to a kind of, I would say, a conflict. That conflict is there in the values and in the norms of our existence, rather than as a problem on scientific understanding of the origins of the universe or the concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, those who don't believe in Allah try to fall back on certain theories and hypotheses, and we can see that over time, those hypotheses have also been discredited, many of them. So for a Muslim, it is important to understand that we believe and we accept that absolute knowledge that's given to us is very much there. So I hope I've addressed the apparent conflict that you're looking at, and I don't believe that conflict exists between science and religious knowledge.
Yeah, that is true, because science is transitory. And for example, the origin of universe. So the Hubble, maybe 50 years from now, there'll be another theory which will be in conflict with this, because new discoveries are coming. So why not separate this endeavor of looking at the universe using mathematics, using physics, and using all that is available to us, and then come up with new theories without considering what any religion or any set of values says about it. And then set of values by itself can again scrutinize what science is saying, rather than combining both of them. To me, this seems to be something really dangerous also, when you say that the Muslims should look at science in a different way than the rest of the world.
You're assuming that there is still a conflict amongst the Muslim scientists and the other scientists, and I don't believe that exists. The whole concept of inquiry, the inquiry is independent. Scientific inquiry is independent. And when scientific inquiry is independent, it has nothing to do with Quranic knowledge or any other knowledge, because that is a realm within the human sphere. What we are talking about is that where the ultimate knowledge that affects human activity, it's not about the inquiry, the scientific inquiry. The scientific inquiry I can come up with and pose anything. Like even the early Muslims, when they took the Greek knowledge, they translated that. That was not Islamic knowledge. That was not Quranic knowledge. And they benefited from that. They discussed that in an open environment. And I encourage that, discuss it in an open environment without blaming anyone. Nothing wrong with that. But the essential part is that when you come to human activity which establishes the order on earth, what kind of a society is a good society? So here we're talking about when the guidance is there, it is for that goodness within us that will give me that akhirah. It is not about establishing whether the earth was or the universe came into being 13.8 billion years ago, or it was 100 billion years ago, or it was yesterday, or it was 4,000 years ago, or 6,000 years ago, as the Bible talks about. So these are irrelevant questions for the Quranic knowledge. The Quranic knowledge is not about trying to establish the process of the origin of mankind or anything else, or about looking at the laws in nature. The laws in nature, the Quran is very clear. They're all created by Allah. It is not that these came by themselves. Now, this is again a matter that can be discussed and debated by anyone. That if I don't believe in God, I'm going to say obviously that it all came by itself. It had nothing to do with the origin of Allah, or rather the origin of the universe, or that Allah being the creator. So that is a philosophical debate. That debate can exist, and people that are going to be atheistic or agnostic or who don't believe in Allah, they will exist. It's not that the world is going to change. Well, for the Muslim thinker, now this is a philosopher and thinker, it has got nothing to do with science here, because all of this is based on postulates and it's based on hypotheses. And the Quran has its own understanding, its own assumption, and I'd say more than assumption, where it says that this, for the Quran, that is a fact that Allah exists and He's the one who created. It does not talk about many things, and it feels that those are irrelevant, because the relevance is towards how to make ourselves into really an excellent society. See, actually, in Europe, it was a bit different, because if you read the Bible, it goes into a lot of details and a timeline, which caused a real problem for the church. The church was not able to keep up with the dogma, and there was an essential conflict. There was a conflict because also the church and the rest had a political conflict as well between themselves. So what Europe went through during its period of enlightenment and that industrial revolution does not have an actual parallel. Amongst the Muslims, we have a totally different dilemma, the dilemma that we see in the post-colonial period, where we see poverty, where we see so many problems that we are facing, the dominance, the oppression that we see within ourselves and outside, does not have to do with Islam as such. But in a way, we have a kind of a parallel, I would say, where certain people who pose to be the religious leaders then try to impose an understanding which is not based on the Quran or the Sunnah. And that has more to do with their own cultural background, with their own tribal understanding. And that is a tussle that we have. That's a separate issue. It's got nothing to do with science again. So the discussion, the conversation that we have in the Muslim societies, in many ways, is very different from what Europe went through. We don't have that central body like Europe did, that church that regulated the religious thought. We've got a very diverse kind of environment within the scholarly circles and the schools of thought. So I don't really see those parallels there as well. I think, like I said, they have a greater problem because the way the origin and history is defined in the Bible is a bit problematic. And the Quran does not have this problem, fortunately.
Yeah, that can be true, which is true. That can be
Also,
true.
you
But
see, the dogma that they developed over the centuries, the church itself, developed certain concepts and thought that were imposing. Unlike uh, our ulama or the Maulvis, they do not have that power to impose their thought over the ummah, whereas the church did, and that caused a lot of problem for them in trying to come to grips with the scientific discovery and the knowledge that happened during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries.
Aslam and Arif, I personally feel that there is no example in Muslim among Muslim scientists that any scientist has stopped any research for fear of finding something which contradicts the Quran, or we have not done enough research at all. I mean, so those are only excuses that if we do any research and it might come, contradictory to the Quranic teaching. So.
but anyway, Kazi, it was a very enlightening lecture in moderation also. You were religious, but as well as a scientist. The topic was correct. So I was impressed really with your knowledge. So it doesn't mean that I can't have my own arguments, but then thank you for this presentation.
See,
Yeah.
Aslam, if you started following me blindly, I'd be very upset.
Well, yeah, great presentation, and to putting together all these thoughts and presenting it 1 hour, maybe 2 hours now was a great achievement.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I guess we should conclude this. I know that Farah is probably not at her desk, so maybe I'll do the honors of trying to bring this session to a conclusion. And thank you all who have stayed right up to the very end. Thank you all very much.